Well, we are in Old Testament 102, and we are in lesson 4 today. And we have been kind of going through the Old Testament, and we have looked at the different ages from the creation stage to the patriarchal stage. And last week we were in the Exodus. And today we are going to move towards the conquest of Israel, going in to the promised land. And so remember, everything hinges on the story that God's trying to tell. And we know when God created the heavens and the earth, they were good. And we know that sin entered into the world. And in Genesis 3, we get a little picture of something that's going to happen as far as sometime in the future. And then we get to Genesis 12, and God says, I'm going to use Abraham and his family. They're going to be a blessing to the world. And that really becomes how the Bible plays out, that it is going to tell this story of how this is going to happen. But in the midst of all that, there's a lot that's going to take place. The Israelites spend almost 400 years in captivity under the Egyptians. And Moses brings them out of that, and you think that they're heading off to the promise of that blessing, but they get sidetracked because of their own unfaithfulness. But God is always faithful. And so in this lesson, we're going to look at Joshua, and we're going to look at really today is just the book of Joshua, and we're going to talk about the conquest. Our timeline for this is roughly 1405 to 1382 BC. And we begin in the wilderness, and they're going to move into this area that we call the Promised Land. Remember, again, they were literally in the wilderness for almost 40 years because of their unfaithfulness, but now they're going to move into this land, Canaan. Some of the key characters, Joshua, who's the leader of the nation, and then Caleb. If you remember, Caleb was with Joshua, one of the 12 spies. They were the only two that trusted God, that God was going to give them this land. And we're going to meet Rahab. She becomes an important character in this story. And then also Achan, who Achan is somebody who decides not to follow God's plan, and it just causes all kinds of problems for the Hebrew people. So some key events, the invasion into the Promised Land, or we might call it Canaan or Palestine. Israel is going to conquer the land, and then they're going to divide the land up. And now, as they conquer, and as you read through the book of Joshua, you'll notice that not all the people that were in those lands were defeated, and there's going to be, in Israel's history, there's always going to be some groups in there that cause problems. So some of the key locations, we have the invasion, which is going to begin around the Jordan River, and then the conquering of Canaan, of this land with the different tribes, and then there will be the division of the lands. 2 tribes are going to be the east of the Jordan, and then you have 9.5 tribes that will be west of the Jordan. So some of the important events. First, you have God parting the waters of the Jordan River so that people can enter into the Promised Land. And it's no coincidence that throughout the Bible, and especially here early on, that there's usually a time when God's people are going through water to something new. So you have the Israelites when they leave Egypt, that they go through the Red Sea. It's a baptism of sorts. And now they're heading into Jordan. Again, the Jordan River is not that big, but I wonder if to some extent the writer is trying to show a symbolic that there's a cleansing going on as they enter into this land. And of course, Jesus will go through the waters of baptism into this new journey, into bringing in the kingdom into its fullness. And of course, we enter into the promised land of sorts as we go through the waters of baptism. So I just think that's interesting. And before they go into this invasion, they go into through the Jordan River. And so another major event is that God causes the walls of Jericho to fall down. And this is going to be another theme that we see throughout the Bible and in the Old Testament. A lot of times we think that God calls the Israelites to do all the work. He calls the Jewish people just to go in and take these lands and do different things. But most of the time, it might even be better to say that these are God's wars. This is God that is conquering the land, because He's going to do a lot of the work. And as far as especially taking of Jericho was an event that these fortified walls were not taken down by the Hebrew people, but they were taken down by God. And so there's other events that take place. There's a battle that takes place where God causes the sun to stand still so that the Israelites can win the battle. Again, there's a heavy focus that these are God's battles, not necessarily our battles. So let's talk about the conquest stage a little bit more. As Israel prepares to invade the promised land, God promised Joshua He would be with him. That's the promise He gave to Moses. It's the promise now that He gives to Joshua. And so Joshua is going to enter in to the promised land. And so to do this, their first battle will be Jericho. And so Joshua sends these 2 spies into Jericho to kind of map out things. And the spies are taken in at a house that belongs to a prostitute, Rahab. And it's what's fascinating about this is that normally the writers probably wouldn't say much except that spies went in and spied out the land. But Rahab becomes a central part of not just this story, but she becomes a central part of the Bible and how God's going to bless the world. And so God uses this prostitute to protect the spies. And then she becomes a part of Israel. And it is going to be through her lineage that the Messiah is going to be born, the King of the world, Jesus. And so she's mentioned. That's why she's mentioned several times in the New Testament. She was the great grandmother of King David. So Israel crosses over to the Jordan River with the priests and the Ark of the Covenant. And God told the priests to step out on the water as if it were solid rock. And when they did, God parted the river and rolled back the waters. And so you have the whole nation goes through the river. And as a memorial of the crossing, Israel places 12 large stones on the western bank of the Jordan River. And Israel is always going to be setting up memorials of what God has done. It's a way of saying that God was here and this is what He's doing. It's sort of like a testimony in church. We might share what God has done in our lives, and we do that to testify about Him. So once Israel has completed the Jordan crossing and was on the western bank, Joshua orders that all Israel males be circumcised. Remember, this is those that are coming in now were not originally circumcised when they came into Egypt. Matter of fact, some of these were not, or coming out of Egypt, I'm sorry. Some of these were not a part, were not even born when they left Egypt, and those who were born in the wilderness were not circumcised at that time. And so again, circumcision was a sign that you were part of God's covenant people. And so Joshua orders this to happen. 4 days after they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, Israel also celebrates the Passover, according to God's instructions, for the first time in quite a few years. And so there's something that hopefully you will begin to pick up as you're reading through Joshua. And that is that their national identity and what kind of people they will be, what they will remember, what they will focus on becomes very important. And so the book of Joshua begins to point out these things. And it's also, this is going to be the first time that they're going to eat the provisions of the land and not the manna that God has provided. Now, on the night before they go into Jericho, the Bible says that the commander of the army of the Lord visits with Joshua. And it's interesting. It's an interesting encounter because, first of all, Joshua, this is holy land of sorts. God, this land that God is placing Joshua on. He's saying, hey, this land is holy land. And we heard this before with Moses, when God had met with Moses. And so this is also an affirmation of probably for Joshua. And so Joshua takes off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. But what's also interesting about the encounter is that Joshua asked this commander, this angel, what side are you on? Are you on our side, or are you on our enemy's side? And the answer is quite fascinating, where the angel answers, I'm not on either side. I'm on what God is doing, and so I fight for God. And that should be a reminder to us that we want to be on what God is doing. So Israel is now going to Jericho. And so Joshua leads them in these marches around the city for 6 days. And then on the sixth, on the seventh day, the priests blow the trumpet, and the army destroys all of Jericho, and they go in and they take care of the things they're supposed to take care of. And so God told Joshua then from there to go and defeat Ai, but Israel gets routed when they go to fight Ai, and the reason that they're routed is they realize that there's a curse on them, and that curse has come from their battle in Jericho. They were told not to take anything in Jericho, but to level it all. And yet a man by the name of Achan, he decides to keep some of the spoils from the war to himself. And because of this crime, he and his family are executed. So at God's command, Joshua is now going to try to recapture Ai, and this time they're successful. And so Joshua renewed Israel's covenant with God. He read the blessings and the curses of the law, which is probably some good timing. In other words, it's important that we are faithful to God. If we're faithful to God, we'll receive blessings. But if we're not, we'll receive the curse. So what's called the Southern Campaign begins with word begins to spread about Israel's victory at Jericho and Ai. And the word begins to spread to the other tribes and communities that are in this area. And so one of them is from Gibeon, and they pretend to be from a far off city. And actually Gibeon was really close to Ai. Some say maybe 5 miles. but they wanted a treaty with Israel, and Israel wasn't meant to have treaties with any of these peoples. But Gibeon, the people of Gibeon lie, are deceptive, and Israel makes a treaty with them. Israel ends up finding out that they've been tricked. So they got to keep their word, but what they do in keeping their word is that they allow them to live, but they make them slaves. And so there are other kings. The king of Jerusalem found out about Gibeon's treaty, and so they're going. The king of Jerusalem is going to attack Gibeon, but what we're going to find out is that Joshua, because he has an alliance with Gibeon, he's going to go to their defense. And what happens is that Joshua attacked the king's alliance before they could attack Israel, and God sent a hailstorm and extended daylight to help Joshua defeat the kings. And so Joshua's men tracked the kings to the cave Makkedah. There Israel captured and executed these 5 kings that teamed up with Jerusalem. And then Joshua continues his military campaign. The northern campaign brought a group of kings together to fight Israel, and they camped by the waters of Merom. And God told Joshua to cut the legs of the king's horses so they could not run. In our modern day and age, it would be like taking the wheels off of trucks, or moving the devices that move tanks. So Joshua obeys, and Israelites not only win the battle, but they also easily flatten the cities in the northern part of the Promised Land. And so the lands are divided up, and here's a listing of how these are divided up. Again, remember there's 2 sections of the land. There's the west of the Jordan, which 9.5 tribes will take. And then there's the east part of the Jordan, where we have 2.5 tribes, and that's Reuben, Gad, and the other half tribe of Manasseh. It's important to know, and this becomes something that sometimes is overlooked, but the Levites do not get any land. That's one of the tribes. They don't get land. The reason being is that they're called to do the priestly duties. And so what they do is that they serve the nation as a whole, and they work the temple, and they take care of these safe cities that are throughout Israel. They're going to minister and serve and do things, justice type things, and take care of Israel. What's important to know is that Peter in the New Testament, he calls us a holy priesthood, and the idea comes from the Levites, that we, like the Levites, we're not a part of the tribes that we live in. In other words, whether you're in Liberia, and depending on what African tribe you're part of, or your country, or even here in the United States, whether it be political parties or the state I live in, that primarily we are not part of these tribes, but we do minister to people. We do serve them as the Levites do, and we show a new way of living. So there is a tabernacle set up in the Promised Land at Shiloh, and the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan set up an altar to remind them that they had a common bond with the tribes of the west of the Jordan. The tribes of the west misunderstood this altar and set up by the tribes of the east. They thought the altar was a sign of rebellion against Israel and the tabernacle, and the tribes of the west threatened to attack the tribes of the east. So the issue, though, was settled after Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, led a group from the western tribes to look into the meaning of the altar. And the altar was a witness that the Lord is God. And in the same way, Jesus told his disciples that their love for each other would be a witness that pointed people to Christ. So Joshua calls Israel together and delivers his last words to them. He reminded Israel that God had been faithful, so they needed to obey his covenant. He went over the history of God's goodness and told Israel to serve God. And so that is a picture of the conquest into the Palestine area. take some time to look at the questions and work through those as a class. That is important. Well, I am thankful that we can go through these scriptures together and look forward to seeing you again next week.